Hey, Kellen, how's it going?
Good. Glad to be here and have this conversation. Things are good.
Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. I think the last time that I saw you was at graduation, 2 years, John F. Kennedy University, the keynote speaker,
Oh
Kellen
shoot,
Lee.
yeah, that was. I think that might have been it. Since all of the craziness ensued in this world, I think that's really the last time we were in person because there hasn't. I don't think there's been an ASP conference. It's really just been a lot of
Yeah.
virtual stuff. So yeah, shoot, JFK graduation. I think that was the last time.
So for everyone listening, tell us about the kind of typical day, if there is one, of a mental performance coach in the major leagues.
Yeah, I think I get that question quite often, and I answer it the same way every time. So I think there's like three different versions of the job. I think there's an off-season version, there's a spring training version, and then there's the
Mm,
season version. So currently, as we speak, I'm in off-season mode. It's really honestly a lot of downtime. It's really great taking advantage of the family time. Occasional Zoom calls here or calls with players there, creating content, really building out a plan for the next year. Really is what
mhm,
I'm really tapped out with it now. Trying to collaborate with all the staff members, with the sports medicine, the strength and conditioning
mhm,
staff, making sure we're all on the same page as we hit the ground running. So really, the off season is the time to recoup, regenerate, but also just set ourselves up for success going into spring training. And then, the spring training day in the life, it's a crazy time. It's a lot of
mhm,
fun. The days are long. It's really 4 or 5 weeks of madness of baseball. Minor league and major league players running around, staff members getting their work done. But really, anytime from my lens, from my perspective, the mental skills
mhm,
world, anytime the players or coaches are at the facility, we're there as well. Whether that's doing their physical prep work in the weight room or on the field, with the rehab guys, the guys returning to play from an injury, just really finding any time, any way to support anything that's going on, whether they're in the cage or on the field, in the bullpen, what have you. We're there. We're there, ready to do our thing. And then typically, what we'll try to do is within the framework of the schedule, time permitting, we'll try to do some presentations. We'll have small group stuff. We'll have some big group
mhm,
stuff, whether it's broken into by position, position players and pitchers, or we'll,
mhm.
sometimes some things we've done in the past are they'll have like station work throughout the course of the day, and there'll just be a mental skills station, and we'll, have the same, 5 to 10 minute conversation 15 different times with all the different groups. So we just try to find a creative way to integrate into the schedule. To make sure that we're sharing the content that we know is helpful for these players to, reach the level of performance that we're shooting for. So, spring training is really just a time to really forge those relationships, again, to set that really good foundation going into the
Mhm.
season, but also get out some good content to our players and coaches. And I will share this. Quite a bit of our work actually focuses on the coaches themselves.
Yeah.
I would say the distribution is probably 50-50 in terms of work with players, work with coaches and staff. And I think it's really important. And the reason I say that and I emphasize that is the more the coaches can speak the language and we can coach the coaches on how to
Mhm.
how to share that message with our players, the more consistent message they're going to hear. And ultimately, in the long run, I think the result of that consistency is the adoption of the concepts, the application of the concepts, which ultimately is what we're shooting for. So,
Sure.
we can talk a little bit more about how we coach coaches, but I think it's really important on that aspect, especially during spring training, because it's really the only time that we're all together as an organization. Because at the end of spring training, we all disperse to our affiliates and we're kind of doing our own thing, and really each affiliate's operating on their own. So spring training is a huge time to make sure that we're dialed in on the
Mhm.
same page.
Yeah, there's a lot happening there, right?
Yeah.
And obviously it varies in terms of the receptivity of the people that you're working with, whether it's coaches or players. And the game of baseball developmentally, player development is evolving very rapidly, and there's a very high emphasis on player development. So, can you just talk about like the receptivity from coaches and players in terms of what you see?
Yeah, I think I'm incredibly fortunate with the San Francisco Giants. we have such an incredible and receptive and coachable group of coaches.
Hmm.
Specifically, I start with the coaches. Everyone's really supportive of what we bring to the table. In fact, we're in the conversation when it comes to rolling out development plans, yeah,
Hmm.
rolling out like practice schedules and designing practice schedules where we're used as a resource
Hmm.
in a variety of different ways, which I think is really cool from the top down leadership. All the way down to the on-field coaches, to the support staff of the athletic trainers and the strength coaches and the biomechanics and the sports scientists. Like we're really trying to integrate as much as we
Hmm.
can with as many people as we can, just to find ways to help them accomplish their goals. So,
Hmm.
and then on the player side, there's definitely a wide range in terms of receptivity or
Sure.
apprehension or open mindedness, but really like one thing I will say that if I do come across players or even coaches as well that are a little bit more skeptical, they're a little
Hmm.
unwilling to jump right in, so to speak. Sometimes I just lean into that skepticism and I just invite it,
Hmm.
and I have a conversation around where do the skepticism comes from. Is it an experience that they had in the past? Is it a preconceived notion of what my work really is?
Hmm.
And then ultimately really ask them a very simple question of how much they believe the game is mental. And generally speaking, that'll generate a really great conversation moving forward of, most people in the game, coaches and players alike, will say 70 to 80%, somewhere in that range. And very often do I follow up with, well, how much time do you spend training it? And there's a
Yep.
huge discrepancy generally. And, so I come in, sometimes jokingly, and I'll go, well, my job is to kind of close that gap a little bit so that you're not training it much less than, that you believe the game is mental. And I'll tell you this, like, my job title is a mental skills coach, but I would never, ever, ever suggest that someone trains the mental side of their game 80% of the time that they train their game. Like I would never
Right.
submit that because the physical side is so incredibly important. But if you're not training it at all, maybe you should shift your like how
Mm.
you manage your training time. So like that's another conversation that I have quite often. If someone's skeptical, but for the most part, like I run into quite a few open minded individuals, players and coaches as well, and which is really encouraging from my side because I have to spend less time selling and more time
Hmm.
doing the work, which is really cool. So um, yeah, and then really quickly, like to finish off the conversation of like what the season looks like after spring training. So again, at the end of spring training, we all disperse. We go out to the affiliates, and then from there, my life looks a lot different. So I could be on the road up to 14 to 21 days a month, visiting all of our affiliates.
Hmm.
Um, we have affiliates all across the country, mostly on the east, mostly on the West Coast, San Jose, California, Eugene, Oregon, Sacramento, California. But then one of our teams is in Richmond, Virginia, which is a little bit tougher since I'm on the West Coast for travel. But anyway, I'll spend time on the road visiting those teams and those players that we built those relationships with in spring
Hmm.
training. And then, I'll typically each trip is 4 to 5 days. I'll catch the games on the schedule, but also try to work in at least one or two presentations with the groups, whether it's again pitchers or position players,
Hmm.
to try to get smaller groups, and then come back home and find other ways to stay connected with those players and coaches over the phone,
Yeah.
on Zoom, and stuff like that. So
Sure.
it's really busy, but it's awesome. It's a great grind, and it's really rewarding work to see the progression and the development of those players.
So before we started recording, you mentioned, sort of being involved with some of the rookie camp and things like that before spring training. How would you say that there's more exposure to mental skills training for the rookie classes coming in, whether it's at the high school level or at the college level before they get to professional baseball?
It's really it's all over the spectrum, all over the board, where we get players who have never even considered the mental side of the
Mhm.
game, and then we get players who are like, oh yeah, like I worked with someone for a while on the mental side of the game. So it's really hard to see, but I will
Mhm.
say that like in like within the framework of those rookie camps or those development camps that we do have during the off season occasionally,
Mhm.
the players tend to be in in like receiving mode. Like give me everything I can possibly take, whether
Mhm.
it's from the strength and conditioning side, whether it's from the sports science side, the sports medicine side, like mental skills side. Like it doesn't really matter. Like if they believe that it can help them reach the goal of getting and staying in the big leagues, they're
Mhm.
more than likely going to give us an ear and their attention, because in that setting it's very development focused, it's education focused, it's really focused. They're focusing on themselves, on how they can possibly just get any inch of advantage they could possibly get.
Yep.
And if they believe that the mental game is going to allow them to get there, they're going to give us that attention. So I will say, like, that's a really great point that you bring up. And in those, like, those camps that are intended for development, that we can easily integrate an educational component, I found a lot of success in those settings, in those contexts, because
Mhm.
the players are in receiving mode. They want it. They're in that state because, again, if you shift the conversation to more in
Mhm.
the season is incredibly hard to, at times, to teach. I have found creative ways to teach the
Yes.
skills during the season,
Yeah.
but it's just different in the off season or in a camp setting where that's all they're doing is just focusing on development, and performance is the ultimate goal, but it's not in the forefront of their mind like it is during the season.
Mhm. Guards are down a little bit. You're not grinding as much. You're not as much caught up in what's going on day to day, and so you've got a little bit of a blank slate. I find it really interesting. I was reading a paper. I think it was a thesis paper, and I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit, but about mental skills training in baseball, professional baseball. And the study found, or the paper found, that performance didn't increase, but longevity did. So, what did that mean? The takeaway was the people who did mental skills training were able to endure the adversity and stay in the system longer, which is basically what you're describing, right? You got guys who are coming in who's saying, like, I want to be here and I want to be here for as long as possible. So give me everything that you can, because I want to be able to go through the ups and downs and sustain it longer than maybe somebody else who's not doing it. Does that sound like what you're saying?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we talk about quite often, or I talk about with players quite a bit, is just this idea of like coachability, but also
Mhm.
just like this ongoing pursuit of improvement. And it really doesn't matter what level you're at, doesn't matter how well you performed or
Mhm.
how poor you've performed. Your goal should never change, of just continuous improvement. And I
Mhm.
would say that someone who is conscious about that pursuit of continuous improvement is likely going to, I would guess, stay in the game longer. Because if someone, let's just say hypothetically, reaches a level of performance and they have the thought of, oh well, I've reached my potential, quote unquote,
Mhm.
they're likely not going to put the effort forth to continue moving up the ladder, continuing developing their
Yeah.
skills. And I think that's a time where some coaching is critical in that moment. So anytime I can help a player adopt this idea, or this concept of continuous improvement and growth,
Mhm.
I would bet that they would likely stay in the game longer. Again, there's so many circumstances that would lead them
Right.
to be released, or let go, or their career ending. Like there's a lot of
Sure.
factors that are outside, that we can also discuss too. But
Mhm.
ultimately, I think the best chance for them to stay in the game longer is just to adopt that continuous growth mindset.
Yep, absolutely. And it's not always the easiest thing to do, right? Especially with athletes, the longer they've been at it, the more conditioned, programmed, whatever you want to call it, they've set in their thinking patterns. And so, especially with highly successful athletes, right? This is the way they've succeeded. Now, perhaps you're trying to break that pattern and saying it's not about your performance on the field, it's about getting better, self oriented versus other oriented. It's not always the easiest thing to do as a mental performance coach, right? It makes sense intellectually, but like it doesn't register sometimes, or it takes a lot of work to get them to buy into that.
Yeah, I think like that dynamic of like self versus others versus team, like that's really hard, because
Mhm.
like the fact of the matter is, the guy whose locker is three down from you, that has the same position of you, like you guys are actually competing for a job, like not metaphorically speaking, but actually
Right.
literally speaking, like that is someone who could potentially get in your way of keeping your job. So that thought, I help normalize that thought for players, and almost bring it up to them, and almost acknowledge the elephant in the room of like, that is really easy to start thinking about how well the other dude who plays your position is playing. Like that is very, very easy. But at the end of the day, I ask him a very simple question: is that helpful? Is that helpful to go through that thought process? And though it's a closed-ended question, if you ask any counseling skills guru, they're going to say don't ask a closed-ended question. But think about how powerful that answer is.
Uh-huh.
If they let's play devil's advocate for a second. If they answer yes, yeah, that's helpful for me to focus on what that other person is doing. I will grab a bag of popcorn and would love to hear that explanation,
Right.
because
How is the next question that comes to mind for me? How
please
is it
expand.
helpful?
Tell me more. Like how could that possibly be helpful for you in your career to divert your attention and effort and energy over to that other human being who happens to be playing the same position of you? How is that
Mhm.
helpful for your career? And it tends to be very powerful conversation. Again, something as very simple as, is that helpful for you, can be a huge
Mhm.
game changer, because if they're honest, I would say most people would say no. And then again, like you said, that follow-up question is like, all right, well, how is it not helpful first? Let's tease out how it's not felt helpful. Let's just not leave it at the surface and just like, okay,
Right.
acknowledge that it's not helpful. Let's break it down. How is it not helpful? And then shift there, like, okay,
Mhm.
what would be helpful for you to lock in on, use your resources, your attention, and your effort on, to
Mhm.
make sure that you're progressing in your career. Because, and again, that might, on the surface, that whole conversation, that whole dialogue might sound quote unquote selfish to some people. But at the end of the day, like, they're trying to reach a level of their career where they're trying to be, financially free. They're trying to reach that, that elite status of being in the major
Mhm.
leagues. So you can't really fault them for that. And at the same time, I would argue that theoretically, if both, let's just say we're looking at two players and they play the same position, if they truly invest in themselves and they focus on what they need to be focusing on and they use the resources accordingly, I
Mhm.
would say they would probably both get better as a byproduct of that. So ultimately, if we're trying to play a team game, which in the big leagues, the game is wins and losses, like that's what it's all about.
Mhm.
Um, that's what we're shooting for, is to for have that competition with
Right.
and for other people, to make sure that you're both moving in the direction you want to go, and without this like that ego operating under the surface of like, I hope he doesn't do well, or I hope he doesn't progress. It's not about that. It's about
Right.
deciding what you should focus on that's helpful for you to
Mhm.
reach the level that you would like to get to. Because I would argue, if you don't use your resource of attention effectively, you're probably not going to reach the level that you would hope to reach.
So what are some of the tools or strategies or skills that you're teaching to really optimize that attention?
Oh man, where to start? I think like, what first of all, like, I'll run you through like my in terms of my process of how I try
Mhm.
to best meet the need of the player. So um, for the most part, if we have this conversation, and I would lead out with something like, what's helpful to focus on, like something around the idea of attention, the idea of focus. So we
Mhm.
lead out with that to start like getting the player talking, and then from there, I first and foremost ask what they already do, to gauge, you know, to what level of sophistication are they dialed in their process.
Mhm.
What guideposts are they using to direct their attention, and then from there, I'll identify, either deficiencies or efficiencies that I can highlight for them to either continue doing with their efficiencies or improve upon with their deficiencies. So some specific strategies, again, I'm kind of dancing around it, but some specific strategies that I found really helpful is really just helping them understand that their first and foremost, at foundational level, like their attention is something that will either help them or harm them in performance. Your mind either works for you or against you, period. So we get to choose. And with that choice, we need to determine what's helpful and what's not. Again, back to that fundamental idea, and then help them establish a process to be as consistent as possible to focus on the things that are most helpful for them to be successful in the moment. And that could look like establishing a routine. That could be could look like breathing exercises. That could look like
Mm-hmm.
focal points. That could look like some helpful self talk for them, just to like
Mm-hmm.
give themselves a cue of some type. Um, that could be a lot of different things, but ultimately help them identify that the consistency of their attention is going to lead to the consistency of their performance. Period. And but first and foremost, they need to clearly identify
Mm-hmm.
and rationalize out what is helpful for me to attend to or to focus on, to make sure that I'm as consistent as possible with my physical skill set that I have.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. So I guess I'm curious, because the theme of this podcast is it's about the transition from high school to college, but we can apply that in so many different ways, right? So what are some of the biggest challenges you see with your incoming players, right? Whether they're coming out of college program or whether they're coming internationally, obviously maybe a different set of issues, or from high school. Like what are the biggest issues that you see for those people coming in who are having a hard time adapting to the new environment?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think I honestly, when I first started this work, I didn't know the answer to that question either.
Mhm.
And so what I did was I leveraged the experience of some of our more veteran minor league players who have been through it a little bit.
Uh-huh.
And when I visit the double A and the triple A guys, I really lean on those
Mm.
folks to help educate me on what the younger players might need. And
Mhm.
the most consistent answer that I got from all the players that I talked to, just casually or informally, just hey, I got a question for you, shoot it out to them. They said self-sufficiency, and what they meant by that was, as you progress through the minor leagues, you have more and more time to that you get to choose what you do to prepare for games, or get to choose what you do to recover after games. And aka it's much less structured than a high school or college program would be.
Mhm.
So when you enter professional baseball, sure, you have a schedule and you have this time is batting practice and this time is the game time, but there's so much time throughout the course of the day that's unaccounted for, where players are essentially given the sense of ownership of what do I do with this time, like how do I manage this time
Mhm.
in a way that's going to be efficient. And that also includes some of the physical prep work that players might do before game. There's a lot of flexibility and a lot of choices that our players are given, at least how we operate as an organization, where they have times where they have to be there, but in terms of what they do from a defensive standpoint or what they do in the cage to do their prep work, a lot of it's left up to them. And
Mhm.
sometimes what I've seen after asking some of the older players and then going to like observe this happen, sometimes some of the younger players are like, well, I don't really know what I need to do, or I don't know how to use this time. So what I suggest to high school or college coaches is to essentially at times give players more freedom to choose and put them in that situation earlier, where they
Mm.
have to take a little bit more ownership of their prep work or what they do to get themselves ready for a game or a practice or whatever that looks like, so that when they get to pro ball, it's not the first time they've ever done it. Because the way we see it is they're adults, and we want them to take ownership of their career, because
Right.
it's their career, it's not ours. We're
Right.
providing resources for them, and of course we will encourage and suggest and highly recommend a lot of things, but at the end of the day, what they choose to do is up to them. And
Right.
also, like, the next level of that conversation, where at least where I think I fit into this puzzle, is what they choose to do is up to them, and what they choose to focus on while they do what they do is up to them as well. And helping them identify what's most important to focus on while they do the things they do is kind of where I fit in as well. So, long-winded answer of saying, like, the better people are at managing their time, identifying, like building that like robust, genuine self awareness, identifying what they need or what they don't
Sure.
need, is a critical skill because that's going to help them be more self sufficient. Um, and again, like I can go in another rabbit hole about like self awareness, but and I think that absolutely plays a factor here
Oh,
too.
it's a huge, yeah, it's a huge part. So I want to connect the dots on that because I think it's extremely important, right? So in an earlier podcast, I had Lindsay Hamilton on from IMG. Awesome, right? Lindsay's awesome. And I asked her, I said, Lindsay, I said, like, what do you see? Like, what do you think is the sort of the resource or the skill that you think that those transitioning from a place like IMG to college, like what's the most important thing? And she's like, resourcefulness, which is basically what you described, right? Like, how do I find what I need to be successful, right? And so the question I want to ask is, because I think this is really important, and I think a lot of young people struggle with it. How how do you find the players that you're working with? How are they about asking questions, asking for help? Like is that I hypothesize it to be a struggle? Like, how do you see that?
Oh man, just like the answer in terms of their exposure to mental skills, like it's all
Just
over the
all over the
map.
place.
It's all over the map. Like there are guys that are just so genuinely curious about everything, where they want to know the reasons why, the reasons
Mm,
how. What are you talking about? Tell me more. What's the research say? But then there's some guys who are like, I don't really care about all that stuff. Just tell me what I need to know so I can do what I need to do, which is
mhm.
fine. At the same time, I think curiosity is something I try to spark and explain how important it can be to both our coaches and our players because ultimately curiosity like to me like curiosity combats complacency because if you're curious about something you're likely
Yeah.
going to try to learn more about it, you're going to you're going to read
Mhm.
something, you're going to watch something, you're going to listen to something, right? And complacency by definition is just like being okay with where you are right now. And curiosity,
Mhm.
I would say, like combats that process of complacency. So
Mhm.
whether it's curiosity about my work or the work of another professional within the organization,
Mhm.
I think there's a lot of value in talking about and discussing how important curiosity is. So
Mhm.
in terms of like how I approach my job, like I try to create the environment and the space that I want them to ask questions because if like to me if like they're asking questions, they're at least thinking about the stuff. And if they're thinking about the stuff, it's more likely that they'll take ownership of what we're talking about, which
Definitely.
man, like I know there's that cliche of like you want to coach yourself out of a job, but like it's true. Like if I can coach these players well enough to where they are focusing on the right thing at the right time, they're consistent with their thoughts, they're handling adversity really well. That's phenomenal. Like that's what I want
Yeah,
for them.
of course.
Because going back to the conversation earlier, that's going to create longevity for them. And I it might be cheesy or corny to say, but like sometimes I'll tell players, I'm like, dude, like I want to see you in the big leagues for a long time. Like that would make me more happy than anything is to see
Mm.
you like do what you want to do. And they'll like, yeah, man, that's really cool. Some guys will laugh at it, but like that's so genuine where I'm coming from of like I really do wish the best for all the players that I have contact with
Yeah.
because I get to know them as people. I get to know their personal lives, which is really cool to see and
Mhm.
just like hear where they're from and hear their story and just to be a piece of that puzzle of getting them to the major leagues and helping them
Mhm.
stay there. Like that's going to be a really a cool experience to see that like happen over and over. And I'm totally genuine when I say like it would make me incredibly happy and so fulfilled to see that process happen like again and again with all the players that I come in contact with.
Yeah. So how is your experience as a baseball player, right, influenced how you got into the field and how does it influence your work?
Yeah. For all the listeners, I'll just give you a quick snapshot of my background. So I
Please.
played I played baseball in college at UC San Diego, go Tritons, and our coach did a really incredible job of incorporating mental game principles into our team. And I was incredibly curious. Back to that word, curious. incredibly curious as I know I reached a level of performance I never thought was possible for myself. So I realized that this whole sports psychology, mental performance thing was a thing, and I'm like, you know what, this is where I want to go with it. So in terms of how I got in the field, like, or where, like, kind of my career path, when I first started grad school, I actually wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go into coaching. You know, as a former catcher, we tend to be quasi coaches on the field as it is. So coaching was always interesting, but
Mhm.
I realized that it wasn't for me. Like I thought about it for a second, and I realized that I just wanted to pursue the mental performance work. And at that time, I went to the ABCA conference, the National Baseball Coaches Conference, in Anaheim that year. I believe it was 2012. And again, I was just about to start grad school, fresh out of undergrad. Like I really didn't know whether I wanted what exactly I wanted to do.
Mhm.
I happened to stumble into a session where someone was one of the mental skills coaches for the Atlanta Braves at the time, and he was talking about his job, talking about what he did, and I remember sitting there as a really young, eager graduate student. I'm like, holy cow, like that's a job, that's a thing, like that's
Right.
exactly where I want to go. I'm a baseball guy, like so. Ever since then, I was really, stubborn and really on that same track. Like that's exactly what I want to do. So
Mhm.
ultimately, when I can clash my two passions of baseball and mental performance together, it's really a perfect storm, so to speak, in terms of a great job situation for myself and I mean, shoot, hanging around a baseball field and a facility and a stadium all day long is pretty awesome. Some people think it's crazy that you could spend 9 hours at a field for a 3 hour game, but like that's just part of the gig, and it's really awesome to be uh, in that world, in that space. Hanging out in the dugout, going out and shagging balls in the outfield, or
Mhm.
occasionally jumping in the cage and helping feed a machine. Like that's so fun for me. And, but ultimately, like at the end of the day, like all those things that I try to do on the field, the on-field support in my mind helps the players, but also helps the coaches because it frees them up to provide that feedback that I think is really valuable to the players. So,
Mhm.
I get out there, I get in the mix on the field a little bit as a former player, and some people in our field may not be as comfortable with that as I am, which
Right.
is fine, and that's a personal choice of mine. But um, I find that you can add a lot of value in supporting some of that on-field stuff.
100%. And I'm glad you brought that up because I was thinking about it. I spent a couple years with a high school baseball program, and I was a baseball player in high school. I played baseball for 15 years after college, and like I'm a baseball guy. Like I would describe myself the same way. And the thing I loved about working with a team was being in the dugout, being able to sort of lend an ear or give a small piece of advice or put my arm around somebody and talk about something in the moment that could really help them right there. Right. And to have that opportunity and to be there, like there's really nothing like it. Right. Like when I hear you talk about it, I go like, I wish that I could spend 9 hours at a baseball field every day doing my job because it's just, it just doesn't, I'm sure it's hard and I'm sure it's draining and all that. But like, I'm sure when you're in those moments, it doesn't seem like work.
No, like being able to I'll share this story. So with our San Jose affiliate, we were fortunate when we won a championship this year in the minor leagues, which was
Mhm.
awesome. And I remember very distinctly the game one of the playoff series. I was sitting on the railing with one of our players, and he wasn't in the lineup that day. Um, and he just turned to me. He's like, "Kellen, like, why is it that playoff games are so like low scoring and it feels like there's more pressure and it's like super tense?" Like he's like, "I can't really describe it, but it's like really tense around here." And I of course I had initial thoughts, and I was like, "No, what do you think though? Like why would you ask the question? Like what makes you think about asking that question?" He's like, "I really have no idea. Like the game just feels different." And I'm like, "Well, is it different?" And he's like, "Well, no, not really." I'm like, "Okay, but like why, like let's think from a performance standpoint, like why does it feel different?" And he's like, "Well, there's a championship on the line. Like every pitch could, change the game." And I'm like, "You're right, but every other game is the same way." And like, so then what we ended up having a longer conversation. We talked about like the impact of anxiety and performance. We started talking
Mhm.
about reinterpreting anxiety as excitement, and I gave him a couple skills and strategies to, like, if he
Mm.
was to get in the game, that day or the next day, like, he'd just be more equipped. And I remember it was so awesome. The next day he was in the lineup, and he had a great first at bat. I think he, like, line drive single or something like that. And he came in the dugout and, like, beelined it straight for me. He's like, I was standing in the box and I was thinking about our conversation yesterday. And he's like, I felt so excited. I was confident and I was, like, so locked in. And he's like, I had to come tell you because it was such an impactful conversation. So, like, having those little moments of, sometimes
Yeah.
you happen to be just watching a game and just having a casual conversation, but it actually can make an impact on the field. And it was so cool to see. And, I don't live for that recognition, but it's like a little reminder for me that, what I'm doing is pretty awesome. And I have to remind
Mhm.
myself of that sometimes. Especially when the days get long and I'm on the road and
Mhm.
I'm traveling. Like, when I talk to a buddy of mine and they ask me, like, what do you do for a job, and I explain it, they're like, that sounds like the coolest thing ever. And like, I know that deep down, but sometimes I have to remind myself,
Yeah.
and little stories like that help bring that to the surface. But yeah, hanging out in the dugout, having a conversation, sometimes about absolutely nothing
Right.
related to the game.
Well, that's baseball
That's
dugouts in
that,
general, talking
that's
about the
baseball.
most ridiculous nonsense ever. That's what makes baseball fun.
I mean, shoot, again, one of our stadiums, like, the moon sets at night, and one of the players was talking about how cool the moon looked one day, and like that is kind of the things that we just talk about in the dugout. But at the end of the day, like, it's such a reward to be able to just to be a small piece of their
Yeah.
of their career puzzle.
Yeah.
And like I said, with that conversation in the playoff game was really cool to see that work just come to fruition for him, and then be for him to be able to recognize that, and hopefully be able to repeat that in the future would be awesome.
Yeah. I think there's something about this work that's really unique in that sense because I feel those same things too. That like that feeling that reward of helping somebody get to where they want to go, but also like not necessarily feeling the desire to take credit for it, nor we're I mean, it's like just to be a piece of that, right? And to
Yeah.
watch them go off and ride off into the sunset, knowing that you helped them, but it's not about me, it's not about you, it's about them, right? Which is awesome. It's just a really cool place to be because what we do, I mean, for you, listen, and I've talked about this some with people. Listen, it's a business, right? What you do is a business. It's about wins and losses. It's about a return on investment in terms of drafting players, paying their salaries, all those things, right? But for us, it's not as much about wins and losses as it is about the players and the on-field staff, right? The coaches. We're there to help them be better, whether they win or lose. Does it affect us? Sure, it does. But does it really matter as much? Not as much, right? And that's a unique position to be in as well.
Yeah, I think, like, dancing between, like, again, what we're talking about, results versus process here,
Yeah.
is a really important dynamic because, again, especially in the context of professional sports, like, results absolutely matter. And I would
100%.
be naive to say to them, to you, to anyone that, forget about them. It's not important.
Right.
But here's the key: even though the results and the stats and, the wins and losses are important,
Mhm.
that's not what we should be, like, bringing our attention to.
Right.
And that's the dynamic of whether we focus on results or not, they're still going to remain important. But again, back to the conversation of what's helpful and what's not, for the most part, for the majority of the time, focusing on results is not helpful for your performance. So that's another conversation when I'm getting pushback about, like, oh, wins are everything, or stats are everything, or my results are everything, my batting average is everything. I'm like, you're not entirely inaccurate here. Like,
Mm.
that's not, I'm not saying you're wrong. What I'm saying is, whether you focus on them or not, they're always going to remain at the same importance. And actually, in fact, you could argue that if you focus on them, you actually create a more importance on for them for
Yes.
yourself. So, like, again, what's helpful? What's helpful? Is it creating more of an importance around your results, or is it creating more of an emphasis on a focus on your process? I don't know. Like, you tell me. And when you break it down that way, people tend to
Mm,
understand, like,
yeah.
oh yeah, like if I focus on winning the game, or if I focus on, from a pitching standpoint, getting 7 innings with 10 Ks, like all those
Right.
result oriented thoughts, those perhaps might not be helpful in the moment. To have a goal and to have a desired outcome, that's a different conversation, because you're thinking about that ahead of time. But when you're in the
Yeah.
midst of competition, you're in the midst of competing, and you're in the midst of a game, that stuff's less important. Let me rephrase. It's as important, but it's less important to focus on. That's
Yes.
that's the key, right? So like that's another like next level conversation I'll have with a guy, is like,
Hmm.
no matter what, your results are going to matter. Like I can't
Right.
like with any good conscience tell you otherwise.
Right.
But what I'm throwing out to you is what you focus on might have an impact of what
Yeah.
happens.
I love the way you've described that. I never I've never really thought about it that way consciously, but that's something I've just learned about communicating about that topic, because it comes up all the time, regardless of an athlete's level, right? Whether high school, college, professional, whatever, it comes up all the time. But the words that you use, the way you describe it matters, right? Because what you just said, there's, hey, these things are equally as important. But if I put all my attention on the result, you're going to distort it and you're going to put more pressure on yourself when you don't need to. Yeah, it's there, accept it, but put the emphasis on what you can control versus what you can't control completely,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly. Because here's another piece of that control, the control aspect, is you can't control how important the results are to other people either.
Mm,
Because here's the thing, you're gonna, like, especially within the context of professional sports,
sure.
every organization is going to value certain statistics more so than others. And perhaps, though, like, let's just
Mm,
say an organization values first pitch strikes for a pitcher. If a pitcher becomes obsessed with first pitch strikes, it adds more importance to them, which is
yep.
fine. But at the same time, like, what you focus on to create a higher first pitch strike percentage is more important than the actual thought of thinking about first pitch strikes.
Right.
So,
Right.
like, that's just a really simplistic example, but
Sure.
that's another piece of this. Of you're going to be in situations as a player where an organization or your team perhaps values a result oriented statistic or
Hmm.
metric very highly, which is great. I think there should be some guideposts and some metrics that you value really very
Hmm.
highly, and we definitely have those as well. But from a performance standpoint, if I'm the performer, I need to take an inventory of what I need to attend to make sure that I give myself the best chance of achieving those metrics.
Right. Yeah. And so for me as a practitioner, what you just described, that's why I value mindfulness so highly on the scale of what's important. Because if you're not aware of where you're putting your attention, you're not aware of what you're focusing on or what's going on in the moment, it's going to be really hard to make the adjustments that you need to make to be performing at your best.
Totally.
Right. I think a lot of people get distracted and caught up in stuff that doesn't really matter in the moment. And that's detracting from their performance. So, how do we narrow it down to that, moment of like, hey, what's going on right now? Okay, I recognize the way I feel and the way I'm thinking, and like, I don't like it. So, let's do something about it versus like letting it overwhelm us. And I think that
Totally.
that's something I try to teach all of the athletes I work with varying degrees of success, but it does make sense intellectually to them. They just practicing it sometimes a little bit harder. I'm curious. I want to go back to you're playing it. So like when you were going from high school to college, what was the biggest challenge for you?
Well, I actually, I went high school to junior college to 4 year
Okay.
college. So I made essentially two transitions, if you will. Um, and I'll tell you this: I remember when I came out of high school, I was a very 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 good student, not your typical junior college student.
Hmm.
I the only reason I went to junior college was to continue playing baseball. So with that said, honestly, one of the challenges I had to deal with going from high school to junior college was my ego, to be honest, because
Hmm.
I never thought in a million years I would end up at a junior college. I had over a 4.0 GPA. I got into great 4 year schools, but I just wanted to continue playing baseball. And so I had to kind of push my ego aside a little bit
Mm.
because, and I'll tell people, I'll tell the listeners, I'll tell anyone, a parent, a family member, like I don't care who it is. Junior college was the best thing that ever happened to me. It is an incredible experience. I got to stay at home for a couple more years. I got to build relationships with my younger siblings that otherwise wouldn't have done if I left home. I got a lot of my general ed out of the way, and I got bigger, stronger, and faster from an athletic standpoint. And I got a lot of playing time, and I got great playing experience from a baseball standpoint. And I learned a lot. And in fact, like to this day, I'll give him a shout out. Buck Taylor is the best catching coach I ever had, and he was my coach in junior college. So um, I'll tell you, like that was a huge challenge for me personally of being able to put my ego aside a little bit because I
Mhm.
worked really hard in high school. I had great grades. I was a student first, no doubt, and that was really challenging for me. But also, like I think from the high school to junior college standpoint, I definitely had a little bit more on my plate. I got a job when I was in junior college, so that was another
Mhm.
challenge I had to navigate around.
Mhm.
And that was pretty tough in terms of just being able to manage my time. But then I think my transition from junior college to UC San Diego, the 4 year school, um, was I think the biggest thing for me there was I didn't know how to study, to be honest, from like an academic standpoint.
I went through that. I went through
Uh,
that when I went to college. Yeah,
like
freshman year was like it was a total overhaul of the way I did things.
because like I said, I was a great student in high school, and if I'm completely honest and transparent, like I didn't really work that hard. Like it was came easy
Oh
to
yeah,
me, you know. Like of
yeah.
course I put my work in, and I couldn't get by with nothing, but I didn't know to actually how to study. And then when I
Mhm.
got to junior college, it was kind of the same, a lot of the same from an academic standpoint, where it came pretty easy to me. But when I got to UCSD, it was incredibly challenging. The
Mhm.
classes were much harder. I was a small fish in a big pond, and um, it was really hard for me. So with that said, like the freedom that I had being away from home for the first time was really hard, and I had to
Mhm.
really build that self sufficiency, like I mentioned earlier,
Mhm.
but also just teach myself, how to obtain knowledge and learn and
Mhm.
be a successful person in the classroom because without that I couldn't play baseball. So
Mm.
also, with that said, like from a playing standpoint, what was really challenging for me was um, I when I first got there, I didn't perform as well as I would hoped, and I had to deal with a lot of adversity when I first got there. So,
Yeah.
I again, baseball had really come relatively easy to me. School had come relatively easy to me, and it was the first time that I was really challenged academically and athletically. So, it was definitely a lot of moving parts for me. But how I dealt with that is I leaned on my teammates, I leaned on my
Mhm.
coaches, I leaned on my parents. I was a half hour away from home, so I could go home if I needed to. But they were a phone call away,
Mhm.
and yeah, I really leaned on the experiences of my the leaders on my team, on the older players. We had a great team chemistry on our team. We're
Mhm.
always looking out for each other, but really leaning on those individuals who had gone through similar stuff to make sure that I'm coping with the challenges
Right.
in an effective manner. But really, I leaned on my coaches. My coaches were really incredible for me, really influential in my life. To this day, I stay in touch with a lot of them.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I think like just the being on my own for the first time and having that the heightened sense of responsibility was pretty challenging. But
Yeah.
what I tell people is, first and foremost, start with your time management. If you can dial in your time and use it to your advantage, you'll experience a lot less stress on yourself when it comes to academic and athletic careers. And ultimately, it's going to give you a great skill set after graduation as well.
Yeah. And the way I usually talk to, young athletes about that is like, what do you value? Right? Like what's most important to you? What are your priorities? Like if you want to go out and socialize or you want to have a good time, that's cool. Like that's up to you, but understand there's a consequence to that, right? So that when you come back and tell me you're not performing at the level you want to perform, but how did you spend your time? Usually there's no disconnect there. It's either I'm doing everything I should be doing and I'm performing well, or like I'm doing all this other stuff that's not really focused on my performance and I'm not getting the performance that I want. So don't be surprised. And I think that a lot of times resonates with them. They're like, oh, he's not telling me what to do, but you need to figure it out because otherwise you're not going to get the results that you want. So I guess the other question, the next a couple more questions. The follow up to that is, what was it like when you finished college and you stopped playing baseball?
That was it was weird, to be honest, at first. My coach brought me on staff. I worked on staff for him for a couple years after I graduated when I was in grad school.
Mhm.
So I was still around the game, which I think made it a little less weird. Where I was on staff, I was interacting with players. I was still within the culture and like the framework of baseball, and it was still really important to me. But at the same time, being a fresh graduate and fresh off a playing career, um, at times it was tough to watch
Mhm.
others play
Sure.
from like a really intimate level. Right, I
Yeah.
knew these guys, I saw them, and
Mhm.
I saw a lot of myself in them, and I
Yeah.
had the thought many times, I could still do this. I could still do this. I could still do this. To the point where, fast forward 2 years after I graduated, I ended up going to play a year of independent professional baseball because I got the itch. I had to go play again. I needed to. And it just happened to work out in my grad school
Y-
calendar where I had a summer where I didn't have a lot going on. So I'm like,
Yep.
shoot, I'm just going to go out. So I played in a really small league in New Mexico, and it was
Wow.
a great experience. I loved it. And then at the same time, at the end of that season, in 2013, I believe, yeah, 2013, it was weird. Like I knew that was it for me. Like I knew like I had
Mhm.
played, I got the itch, I
It was
scratched the
closure.
itch.
It was
And
closure.
yeah, I mean, I played really well. I had a great team. I love my teammates. It was such an awesome experience. I definitely wasn't doing it for the money, that's for sure.
I could just
Uh,
imagine.
but like I knew like, okay, this is time. And I think it was, I was a little bit older. I was, 24, 25 at the time. And I'm like, I'm not going to make it to the big leagues. Like, I know that's not the case anymore.
Yeah.
So, and I was close to graduating with my master's degree. So I was on my way to starting that career. And I'm like, I think I'm good. Like, and it was kind of
Mhm.
like, it was a very subjective feeling of being satisfied or like complete with my playing career. And
Mhm.
it was a very interesting experience. I can't really describe it too well, but I just knew that I was done, and really just shift my focus on, all right, so how am I going to
Right.
get to my career goal? Again, I had gone to that conference and I'm like, I saw that guy and I'm like, that's what I want to do.
Right.
So what's next? Like, how do I move forward? So I really was able to accept the fact that my career was done and over, and that's okay. And I was good with it. And I really just shifted to, how can I make a difference in this field?
Mhm.
And I guess it probably helped being around sports and being around athletes a lot because, I relate well. And they're my people. They're my people. So
Yeah.
that probably made it a little bit more easier for me. But I think it was really the biggest thing for me to take that step forward into that transition process was just the acceptance that it was done. And there's nothing I can do
Mhm.
to change that process. And going back to being accepting of what we can control, like my playing career and the decisions I made as a younger player, they're done and over
Mhm.
with, and I can't change those. And
Yeah.
not to say that I regret them at all. I just, there's things that I can't change the past. So ultimately, in order to influence the future, I had to move on and accept it. And I think that was really a powerful moment in my life where I'm like, all right, this is career time. This is, I got to put my big boy pants on and move on.
Yeah.
And I was okay with it. Like I was good with it.
Yeah.
And I think that acceptance really set me up for success moving forward.
Yeah, and I'm sure it doesn't hurt that, like you said, you had something to look forward to, right?
Yeah,
Something that you were really passionate about pursuing, so that you could pick up and move on to the next endeavor. I think for a lot of people, when they're forced out and they don't really know what they want to do, that's where it gets hard from a mental health standpoint. Depression and just sort of the confusion that goes with, like, how do I make sense of, like, I don't have this anymore in my life. But when
totally.
you've got something you want to do, you're going for it, right? You're taking that effort and energy you put into baseball, now you're putting it into the next thing, which is amazing that you're there, and now you're in the game, every
Yeah.
day. Funny how the world works. But last question is, and I ask this to everybody, or I try to, if you had to give one piece of advice to a young athlete, like, what would be that, like, one thing that you would share with them?
One piece of advice for a young athlete. I would say continue to learn, expand your horizons,
Mhm.
and find creative ways to stay energized to do what you're doing. And what I mean by that, and there's a couple different thoughts in there. So like continue learning. That includes your craft. That includes about yourself. That includes about your skill set. And just finding creative ways to like stay energized. If you play sports for long enough, it's very, very, very easy to fall into the trap of doing things because you've been doing it in the same way,
Mhm.
and therefore, what the impact on attention when you go like the way I put it, going through the motions is action without attention, and it's very easy for someone who's been doing something or like a drill or an exercise for the like a long time just to go through the motions because they're just not thinking about it. So find creative ways to like challenge yourself. And again, we're getting into like stepping out to your comfort zone, but it's a different way of saying that. You just find creative ways to continue learning what you do and like like
Mhm.
keep yourself energized in doing what you're doing because it's very, very easy to fall into that trap. So whether you want to be a professional or a collegiate athlete or a high school athlete, it really doesn't matter. The
Mhm.
same principles apply. Find creative ways to stay energized and continue learning and developing your craft and yourself and just learn about yourself because
Mhm.
um, you last longer than your playing career. No matter what you do, you last longer than your playing
That's
career. So keep that in mind. And self
yeah.
awareness is always relevant and always applicable. So the more practice you have building your self awareness and understanding yourself, the better, more efficient human being you'll be in the long run.
It's a great way to end. It's awesome. Thanks so much, Kellen. I appreciate you coming on the podcast. It was great to see you
Yeah, it was a great
virtually, face to
conversation.
face, and it was a great conversation. I always love to hear what you have to say. So, thanks so much. Have a great and good luck this season, and hopefully, we'll talk soon.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you.